The first piece that we're going to read all together, regardless of whether or not you choose for your applied issue food or consumption, is the introduction to a larger book written by Layna Droz. And this book presents a new way of thinking about environmental ethics and responsibility, which really pays attention to how interconnected we all are and is sensitive to varieties of worldviews and different beliefs that people have. So it's really trying to find a way to present a form of environmental ethics that motivates individuals to act regardless of kind of base level worldviews or assumptions or beliefs about the world. There are a couple of key questions that motivate this author's project, such as in a global context of a pluralist worldview, how can we build common grounds to take action and tackle environmental problems? What is our individual moral responsibility in this collaborative task? And what do we actually want to sustain? In this last unit, these are really the kinds of questions we're going to be focusing on. We're interested in trying to take what we've learned and move from more abstract theory to looking more at applied problems. We've done a lot of theory, we've looked at a lot of different environmental ethical perspectives. And now in this unit, this is our chance to say, okay, how can we move from theory or take what we've learned from theory and move into the world of applied environmental problems? And this is one piece that tries to do that and provides us a way to think about that. So that's why we're starting with it. Most of the pieces we've looked at so far have really tried to argue for a specific environmental ethical theory. And a lot of you have been really unsatisfied by that kind of approach because each perspective has certain flaws and benefits, right? So you've pointed out a lot of times how it would be nice to pull from different theories to build a better theory that doesn't have the drawbacks of each individual theory. So instead of arguing for a specific environmental ethical theory as such, this author is doing something similar. This author is going to try to build common ground that can unify and motivate environmental action, regardless of our own personal worldviews, which are socially embedded. So the idea here is if we're sensitive to the facts that people's worldviews, the things, the beliefs, the ideas, the things that we pull on when we make decisions, when we interpret the world around us, are socially embedded. They depend a little bit on how we grew up, where we grew up, the things that we've been exposed to. How can we motivate action on environmental problems without saying that there has to only be one worldview that's acceptable? So she's trying to give us a way to acknowledge plurality of worldviews, plurality of maybe how we think or how we justify particular beliefs about value, about good, about right and wrong, but still motivate environmental action. So you could be on this kind of account, you could think that maybe centrism is the correct kind of understanding of the value of the environment to us. And you could still take action on environmental problems on this kind of account. Or you could be non-anthropocentric in one of the many different ways that we've talked about. And you could still find motivation on this kind of account. Before we get into the weeds of her contribution, the author is going to discuss the environmental situation and the urgency to address environmental issues. So one important idea that she proposes is that environmental problems are not merely questions of facts and of the best technologies to be used to improve the material situation, but they actually call into question our ways of life, our choices, and the values that we attach to different ways of leading one's life and human life itself. She argues that the environmental problems are human problems because humans' ways of life are their main cause and ripple through our webs of complex relationships with each other species, and the interconnected world. What does this mean? She's really pointing out how environmental problems aren't just reflective of the current state of the environment. They're not just the fact that we have a lot of pollution or the fact that we are experiencing mass species extinction. They're actually reflective of a deeper thing, which is that our life as humans is out of balance, that we're living in ways that are not good. And so we need to change kind of fundamental things about human life. So that's what she's talking about. She's saying, yes, there's the actual symptom, the environmental problem, but then there's this deeper thing that we also need to think about, which is how the ways that we live are maybe out of balance or problematic, which is something that a lot of the theories that we've touched on have talked about. It's been in the periphery of a lot of the works that we've looked at in this class, how environmental problems are not simply problems with how the environment is right now. They're deeply intertwined with concerns about human life and how it's being lived, the nature of our connections and impacts on other living things and the environment. So, therefore, this kind of view of environmental problems shows us that environmental problems are symptoms. They're really reflective of much deeper fundamental issues with human life and well being. And one way to understand the connection that we have to all of these other things in our life, how we can understand how we connect and how the way that we live affects all of these different things, is this concept of planetary health. Planetary health tries to capture the interdependence of environmental health, animal health, and human health. According to the author, for lives to flourish, we need a healthy planetary environment, including habitats for diverse species and ecological connectivity between ecosystems. So, one thing that we've started to try to do is capture how we're interconnected to the environment, right? Our health seems to depend on the health of the environment. So when our actions, the way that we're living, are affecting planetary health, then we need to make changes. We need to shift the ways that we're living. Planetary health is an interconnected measure that we can use to say, okay, how healthy is our humans? How healthy are animals? How healthy is the environment? And how connected together is the planet's health? If we look at all of these different things and how they connect, what kind of understanding of planetary health can we have? And how should we use that to motivate our own actions and change the way that we're living? At a fundamental level, environmental problems can be seen as reflecting the consequences of certain ways of life that rely on certain worldviews and ideas about what a good life is. For example, consumerism. So, when we think about environmental problems as a symptom, they can be symptoms of certain worldviews, of certain ways of thinking about certain goals about the good life that are causing us to act in certain ways that are having these kinds of negative effects. So if we think about consumerism, if we have the worldview or the belief that the best kind of way of life is the life that consumes the most, that has the most access to consumable goods, however we think about that, not just like tangible things, but also consumable things like the ability to travel or these other kinds of ways. If that's what we think human well being is, the good of human life is, then of course we're going to consume more. And our consumption has really negative impacts on the planet and the environment. So, one way that we can look at that environmental problem of all of the plastic pollution, for example, or consumerist pollution that we're experiencing is as a symptom of the deeper problem that human life, the way that we think human life is valuable, maybe is problematic if we determine it in terms of consumption. If there's something wrong with our worldview and the ideas about what a good life is, as environmental problems seem to suggest that there might be, then no amount of ingenious technological innovation to solve environmental problems will necessarily address the underlying concern. The idea here is even if we could progress our way or technologically advance our way out of all of these issues, if there's deeper underlying problems about the ways that humans are living, the things that we believe, our worldviews, then no amount of technological innovation will necessarily stop the problems because we'll just keep adding new environmental problems that are symptoms of these deeper underlying issues. One thing that we might do in order to combat environmental problems is to try to address these underlying concerns. The author points out a lot of interesting features of the current situation, but one thing that I want you to particularly think out is how changes in our social landscape and technology have significantly changed how an individual ethical agent is exposed to and has the ability to contribute. As the author points out, individual ethical agents are connected and exchanging with more conversational partners than ever before. The consequences of individual agents' actions are also taking place at a very large scale. This is a positive and a negative, right? We live in an interconnected world. We, as individuals, have more opportunities to impact and engage with others than we've ever had before. And so the impacts of individual action can be both much more devastating and much more positive. That's something that I want all of us to spend a moment thinking about is there is a lot of ability for individual actions to have really large effects in the current day and age, and that's both good and bad. Maybe trying to spend a minute thinking about how your actions and our actions have more of an effect than maybe we tend to think that they do, or what opportunities we have to have a large impact if we're passionate about environmental problems or these kinds of issues. Okay. The purpose of the author's project is really to try to provide some motivation and tools for assessing our individual role in a globally connected world. So I want you, though, to really think about this in the context of what we've been learning. The author then moves on to talk about what ideas, concepts, worldviews, ethical perspectives, and values someone has is important because we use these things to make and justify our decisions. The reason that it's important to think about these kinds of things is because our worldview and all of the things that that includes really affect the way that we process the world around us, the decisions we make, and how we justify the decisions that we make to ourselves and to others. Your problem solving is mediated through your programming. In effect, the code in your brain that's been built up over your upbringing, including the people, ideas, beliefs, media, education, norms, social pressures, political pressures that you've been exposed to and internalized. These things function as our compass in orienting ourselves. So when we're faced with problems, one of the things that contributes to how we solve that problem, or maybe the dominant thing that contributes, is this kind of programming. It's your worldview that you have. You pull on these things in order to develop solutions or to even identify problems. Depending on your worldview, some things that are very clearly problematic to some people may not even register as problems to others. Given the importance then of the concepts and beliefs that people tend to have, it's important to have a sense of the general ones that people hold. One dominant idea that she identifies is the view that the non-human world is a resource that with no other value to us than use value. So we've talked a lot about this, how the only kind of things with intrinsic value are humans and everything else just has use value to humans. So she's identifying this as a dominant idea that a lot of people have currently. It's important to a lot of people's worldviews. Now, there can be reasons on these kinds of accounts to treat the environment well. So, again, we've talked about anthropocentric ethical perspectives that do give us reasons to treat the environment and give us reasons and motivation to address environmental problems. These things have included things like preservation for future generations, contributions to well being, these kinds of things that could give us a reason to really care about the environment. But a lot of times when we view the environment only as use value and we don't have these kind of richer anthropocentric ethical perspectives, what we actually mean or what we actually think is that no, the environment is just there for our use and we don't really have any duty or responsibility to take care of the environment. She then moves on to the debate about value, what types of things have it and the kind of value that they do have. Again, we've covered this ground a lot of times in this class, so I'm just not going to do it again. But I'm going to move on to the section pluralism of worldviews and extremism. So she begins this section by writing about how a high diversity of worldviews coexist in our interconnected world. Again, a worldview is a comprehensive conception of the world from a specific standpoint. A worldview for her captures all of the things that we've been talking about that affect how people see things and how they decide to act. Once we understand that, it becomes really clear how changes in our worldview, for example, if we accept an environmental ethical theory as a guide for our actions, can have concrete implications going forward. So if your worldview changes or a group of people's worldview changes to include reasons to act and beliefs that encourage you to act towards the environment in a better way, you're going to see ripples of that in your actual actions and your concrete actions. Because they influence or even determine decision making for individuals, they have consequences to action and then consequences to the world. So worldviews are really important for her and also for a lot of theorists. A lot of the reason that we've spent this entire class talking about theory is because there's a belief that if we have theories that motivate us to see the environment in different ways to change our worldviews, that will ripple out into actions. And then actions multiplied by many individuals will have really profound consequences for addressing environmental problems and for our relationship with the environment. She's going to argue that there is a high diversity of worldviews that may conflict with each other And that even when superficial disagreements seem solvable through rational dialogue and self consistency and inquiry, there are still multiple ongoing conflicts rooted back to rock bottom beliefs. From there, she's going to take for granted two facts and the assumption that conflicting worldviews are not to be hierarchically regarded, and the view that value and worldviews are pluralist. What does this mean? So she's saying, look, if we look at the world around us, it's very clear that worldviews are plural. There's many different worldviews in many different cultures for many different people, and they seem to be able to coexist. And even if we could all sit down together and have rational dialogue and inquiry, we probably wouldn't be able to come up to one worldview. And in fact, it's possible that we ought not to. She takes what she calls a precautionary position, which is that one single truth does not exist and that extreme caution must be taken when judging diverse value charged worldviews. So she actually wants to say, not only is this true, but this is actually a good thing. We ought not to want there to be only one worldview. We ought not to want to establish one dominant understanding of the environment or of a worldview. We want some kind of an account that motivates individuals to act in regards to the environment in a respectful and responsible way that doesn't require us to adopt one worldview, one kind of understanding. We want one that allows us to have many different kinds of worldviews because there is value in this kind of pluralism of worldviews. She takes a sidebar to talk about scientism. So there's some question of how scientific or empirical claims play into environmental ethics. Why is she talking about this? She's basically saying, look, some people, when we start talking about worldviews, start saying things like, oh, but there are factual worldviews and non-factual worldviews, right? And to an extent, that's true. There are some worldviews that include beliefs that are factually false. But what she really wants to point out to us is that, in fact, most of our worldview is not factually based. We have beliefs about value, things that there's no empirical answer for. And so treating those as empirical is incorrect. We have to be able to, when we're looking at worldviews, tease apart empirical facts from beliefs and value judgments. If your worldview, for example, contains a really strong belief that empirically species extinction is not occurring, then we can demonstrate that that is a false belief. And it's not that we're claiming that your valuing is wrong. We're claiming, no, you actually have an incorrect empirical belief. But most of the things that our worldview is based on are not empirical beliefs, they're value judgments. She wants to make sure that we understand that distinction. One interesting idea that she also gives us is that perceivers, valuers, thinkers, and believers are always individuals, yet meanings and beliefs are built through interaction with other people. So people that hold worldviews, people that act on them are always individuals. But the development of worldviews is something that's happened in connection with others. You don't come to your worldview alone. You come to your worldview through exposure to others, through inheriting a lot of beliefs from the society that you're in, the political system that you're in, your parents, these kinds of things. But you yourself are an individual. So you hold this belief, this worldview as an individual. We all do. We all hold our worldviews from a particular standpoint as individuals. But the way that these worldviews are constructed is done in connection with others. And so that's something that I think is really interesting to think about and think about the implications of that for activism and political action. Worldviews are the frames and lenses through which one perceives and makes sense of and acts on the world. Noting them is important because worldviews are not neutral scientific facts. So again, she's just restating the fact that a worldview is not a fact. They are maybe empirical facts that are part of worldviews, and those can be true or false. But the majority of what we say when we talk about worldviews are not facts. They're beliefs, they're value judgments, they're norms, they're these kinds of things. So when discussing environmental problems in policy and media, the author says that there's kind of two dominant positions that are being talked about right now that are probably part of a lot of our worldview. One or the other of them is. One is naturalism, which is the view that only natural law and forces govern the universe. So this is the idea that all things are physical. This kind of position is very popular right now. And it's the belief that there's nothing There's no spiritual aspect. There's nothing super physical. Everything just boils down to physics and to physical matter. The idea here is that there may be no spirit. There may be nothing that can't be boiled down to atoms. This is what naturalism, the idea of naturalism is. There's another thing that she identifies, though, which is takes this position and goes farther. So scientism holds that we should base our values on science. For example, in thinking about environmental problems, an ecological scientist might argue that an environmental crisis is not ethical, but only a factual question coming from our ignorance. So scientism is the idea that value is meaningless and that all of the things that we say are value judgments really just boil down to empirical questions. For sure, people in ethics find this to be a bit of a problematic view. So she just wants to identify it as a thing that some people believe. People with this kind of belief might say things like, species extinction is an accident that will be solved by better technology and understanding. On this kind of account, it's often thought that progress will solve all of our problems. It'll bring us the solutions we need, and no reassessment of our worldview and the way of life is needed. And so she's saying, okay, this is a belief that a lot of people have, but we need to recognize that even this belief contains certain ideas about rationality, science, and what progress means. So even scientism, which is supposed to be the most value-free worldview, is based on assumptions and beliefs and ideas about what rationality is, about what progress means, and about what the nature of science is. So even these kinds of worldviews ground out into assumptions and belief and value judgments that people make. Even if we took this kind of a worldview, there's ways to say, no, actually, there's still space for a reassessment of our worldview and a reassessment of how we interact with the world, because it's not just based on empirical facts. It includes value judgment. It includes ideas about what the world is like. The author now goes back to pointing out that what we need to address environmental problems is rarely full consensus of worldviews, but rather a set of tools that are just consensual enough to support dialogue and common action. So think here of the example of human rights. The concept of human rights is actually very vague. There's not a clear kind of universally accepted understanding of what that means. But the idea of universal rights has enough content that a lot of different people in a lot of nations with a lot of different worldviews can take meaning from it and act on it. It conveys enough meaning to be used as a tool by people with a wide variety of worldviews. She thinks that we can come to something similar when we're addressing environmental problems. She's going to try to propose a kit to help us address environmental problems without requiring consistency in our worldview. So she's going to try to say, look, what is not needed is that we all agree that we all have one worldview, which would be bad even if we could accomplish that. What's necessary is that we have things that are agreed upon enough to give us a starting place to address all of these problems. And that is possible because we already do it. One example of this is the concept of human universal rights. This is an inherently pragmatic project, meaning that it prioritizes real world problems over principles. When we're trying to address environmental problems, she's going to be talking about trying to answer the question of what, how, and who. She wants to talk about what is sustainability, who is responsible, and how to use her pragmatic guidelines to address broad environmental problems. So I want to pause here for a second. I think this is a really good basic format for inquiry that you can use as you go into your final project. Using this idea, we would ask questions when we're faced with an environmental problem. What is the environmental problem? What are the causes of it? What are the effects of it? What are the consequences of it? And then also questions like, how has it come about? How can it be solved? And who is responsible? Who has caused this problem? These kinds of things. And this provides a really nice way to dig into environmental problems. Okay, one of the ways that she proposes to build the pragmatic guidelines is to accept moral minimalism. So basically, she's going to try to build a global framework, one that can be adopted by most groups in most nations through the use of premises that are already widely accepted and part of the common sense of different cultures. This allows for some common ground and a direction towards coming to action plans that can be adopted broadly outside of just specific worldview. She's going to propose only two premises that she thinks can be consensual enough, commonly agreed upon enough to act as like the basis for her toolkit. So the first is that we value human existence. This is a belief that she thinks is broadly held by many different cultures, backgrounds, and could be used to create common ground for common action. The second is that a healthy environment and a meaningful milieu are necessary conditions for human existence. So basically, this is the idea that we need, as humans, to have a good human life, a healthy environment, and we need a lot of diversity in that environment in order for human existence to be good, and we value human existence. So building off of those two premises, she argues if a healthy environment is a necessary condition for human existence, then environmental sustainability is a necessary condition for human survival. What she's going to end by saying is that environmental sustainability can be understood in its most common form, namely that humans use ecosystems at a pace in a way that allows their self-regulations. And this should really be the basis for kind of our common view and the basis for the toolkit that she's going to provide in the rest of this project, which we're not going to get to cover, unfortunately, in this class.